A very good evening, guys. Today we are going to understand about promise chaining, but by sending a request to the server. In the previous examples, we understood about promise chaining, but using a simple function with a set timeout delay. But this time we will implement the same example with a server request, because in reality, most of the times when you're making a request which is asynchronous, is happening by calls to the server. The library that we are using is Axios, and I've just added the CDN link of the library in the beginning of the script, just before the script tag. So let's first understand with the diagram what we are trying to accomplish here. So first we have a user which has to get the TIN, which is the tax identification number, if you provide the employee ID. So there will be a call, will be actual function that will make a request to the server for getting the TIN, similar to what we did last time. So here is the flow. The flow is that first we have to have a function that gets me the TIN number of the employee if we give the employee ID. So the input should be the employee ID. So the input to the function is going to be employee ID. And what this function will do, it will make a request to server and get TIN. Now the output from this function is going to be what? Returns TIN. This TIN actually is an input to another function. And what this function does, takes TIN as input and returns tax amount. So the return value is what? Tax amount. Simple. So let us try to map these functions also now. So this is my first function, which is going to be the get tax identification number. And this is going to be my second function that is going to give me the employee tax amount. The first function expects employee ID, this value, and the second function expects TIN. So what do we need to input this? We need to input a TIN value. So here we are going to write input TIN. So this is overall diagram of what we are going to do today. So let's get started now. For server communication, we are going to use a library called Axios, as I have already discussed. Now let's understand the URLs first. There are going to be two URLs. First is going to return me the TIN. If I give it an input in the URL, the employee ID. The second URL returns me the final tax amount, and I have to input the TIN that is returned from the first URL. So this is what is our URL structure. We have to make a GET request and pass the value. In the first case, it is the employee ID, and the second case, it is the TIN. So these are the two URLs which we are going to use in our application. Now going back, let's try to understand how we can get this done. Now, one thing we need to understand, guys, that Axios get, post, put, delete, all the methods that actually make a request to the server, they return a promise. Yes, Axios function returns a promise. So this is an important point, that Axios functions return a promise, which means whenever I'm making a GET request to the server, I get a promise returned to me. That's important thing to understand. So now this example is very simple. The first is the function that gets me the tax identification number, and I provide it the employee ID. So how do we do it? Similar to the last time, we just make let promise OB, but this time we don't need to create promise. The good thing is Axios automatically creates the promise and returns your promise object. So I just need to make a request like this, axios.get with the URL, and then it returns me the promise object, which I return from this function. So this job is done. Now, second is that we have to get employee tax amount when we provided the TIN. So I will just remove the previous examples which I have done, and instead of that, again, I'm going to do axios.get, and this time my URL is going to be the second one. One thing to keep in mind is that this last value is variable. So I need to do plus, and I need to add this value outside like this. Or in fact, I can even put it inside using the template variable notation like this. So similar thing I need to do with my first function also here. The last value is the employee ID, so it has to be dynamic, which means I'm going to use my template variables provided by ECMAScript, and here I'm going to write dollar and the value, which is the employee ID. That's all. So that's all. So now we are again able to make a request to the server using Axios, but keep in mind, we are not handling the response. We are just returning the promise, because the handling will be done by our next function. So now coming back here, how do I do it? Pretty simple. I make a request to get tax identification number function, and I get a promise returned. Then I handle the promise like I did last time. Return promise dot then, and inside this function, I get the TIN value from the first URL. I again make a request to the server and return the promise, which is handled in the next then. This is what exactly we have done in our previous example. So this part of code remains untouched, because here we are just handling the promise. Only the code where we are making a request to the server, these two functions need to be modified. So I make a request to this function, get tax identification number. I get a promise, and then I resolve using then. But inside the then function callback, I again make a request to the get employee tax amount, providing it the TIN that is returned from the success of the first promise. And then again, I return the promise, which is handled in the next then. And then we have the catch if we have to catch any errors. Now, this particular example is asynchronous, and we are actually making a request to the server to get the data. So now let us try to see the output of this program. Let's save it now and open it in the browser. So also, and let us see if we are able to get the output. Okay, I see some error, but not a problem. So, all right, I get the reason why this is failing. The reason is the server actually returns an object to us. Let me show you how my backend is returning the value. This is my first example where I'm making a request to the server to get the tin, and what I'm returning is actually an object, which gives me the status and the tin value. In the next example, I am again making a request and sending the tin number, which returns me the final tax amount. So there is a small change, very minor change, which is the response. So what do we do here? Well, in that scenario, this tin actually is the response value. So I will just write here a response, and it should be response. Let's look at it. Response dot tin dot tin. So the value that I'm going to send is also going to be response dot tin. And finally, the tax amount will be again. So let's change this variable to response, because now this is a response from the Axios request when it is successful. And here I'm going to write response dot tax amount. Let's see if it is right. Tax amount, where A is capital. Let's try to again run this piece of code and see what is the output. I will open the console this time. It will take some time, of course. Okay, the tin number is undefined. So why it is undefined? No problem. Such situations do happen. So we can see that even in the first request, we are not getting the response here. It is saying the tin is undefined at line number 25. So we have got the response. All right, there is one more thing which we need to do. So if we look at the request, probably we will understand better. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you the network to understand what we are trying to do here. So when I make a request, you can see the first request, when I get the response, okay? So the response is fine. The only difference is that whenever we make a request using Axios, it is response.data. I just did that small error. So the response.data actually contains the response exactly received from the server. So now this should be fine. Let's run the application again. Open the console. And okay, we have got in successfully. And the next request also gives me the tax amount successfully. It is working fine now. So that is all. It is very simple, nothing complicated, because all the promise creation resolution is actually done by the Axios itself, because Axios returns your promise object. So the promise creation, I mean, the object creation is internally done by Axios. So this is my piece of code here, and we can see here that we can also get sequentially the values from subsequent requests when we have one request that returns some value which has to be used by another request. And that is how we can implement the chaining of promises. The same thing can be done for as many requests as we want. It can be one request, two requests, three requests, four requests. As long as they are dependent on each other, we can keep on, sending the promise object and resolving them outside using the then. Interestingly, since there are two promises, there are two then to resolve them. So if there are four requests, they are going to be four then. That is all we need to do. And you can see how simple my code is to get the data from the server when we have, dependency on one request for another request.